Bismillah, the idea, the word itself, I think, is relatively new. It's really, it's something, a 20th century obsession about consciousness. Right. I think the pre-moderns would have had a very different view of things. In our tradition, knowledge, God has absolute knowledge of all things, knowledge of God's self. And that knowledge, we have been given a portion of knowledge, but it's very limited, but it enables us to know God. And there's this idea, I think, that the mind itself, we actually believe in these what are called degrees of existence. So one of the degrees of existence is a mental existence, that things have mental existence. So we can think of things like, I can think of a unicorn, and that has a mental existence. It doesn't have an extra mental existence as far as we know. I mean, a narwhal's an interesting unicorn in the sea. But the idea that God has given us imagination, that we can think of things that never were and perhaps never will be, all these contingent possibilities, and that gives us an indication that God has infinite possibilities, that God can actualize an infinite number of possibilities.
Because our minds represent God in some way.
It's an indication, it's an approximation.
If we can imagine things that don't exist, then God can imagine
God has given us a something of an understanding of reality. And that's why our attributes of hearing, of seeing, of sight, of consciousness, of intellect, of imagination, that these are all things that enable us to somehow get some approximation. But the most important thing in our tradition is this idea of waking up. There's an idea that we're actually asleep. So Imam Ali said, all of humanity is asleep, and when they die, they wake up. And then he says, die before you die. So there's this idea that we're actually not conscious, that we're actually asleep, we're dreaming. And so there's this idea of awakening to reality, awakening.
And that's something that can occur in life, or has to wait till after?
It preferably occurs here. If it doesn't occur here, it will occur with the great awakening, which is death. Yeah. So there's this idea of death before death. The idea of, we have a word in our tradition called fana, which is almost identical to nibbana in the Pali or nirvana in this. It means to be blown out. And so it's the idea of having the self blown out so that it can perceive reality.
Is that in core Islam, or is that in the?
That's in core Islam. That's in traditional.
That's not mysticism, Sufism.
Well, the thing about when they talk about Sufism and mysticism, all of the Muslims had some commitment to mysticism. All of them. Ibn Taymiyyah uses the word fana. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, scholars that are traditionally associated with a kind of anti-mystical doctrine, they use these doctrines. They were first formulated by a great Baghdadi scholar, Imam al-Junayd, and they're accepted by the Muslims. So I believe it's core Islam, and I'm not saying that as some kind of heterodoxic view. This is orthodoxy. It really is traditional Islam. So yeah, there is an understanding that we can wake up to reality in life. And that's called, we could call that the path of sanctification. So the other path is the path of salvation, which the vast majority of humans take. And that's just getting by. There's a bare minimum, a baseline of practice that if you do that, you're promised salvation. But there are those in the world that it's not enough for them. They want to know God here and now. They really want to experience God, and they set out on that pursuit, and it's a dangerous pursuit because there's a lot of thorns on that path.
What kind of thorns?
Well, self-delusion is a big one. You know, to think that you've actually had some kind of a rival. There's a great Zen story about the enlightened monk that came to talk to all the Zen, and then he said, all enlightenment is an illusion. And so everybody left except one. And he said, what are you doing? He said, well, I've been sitting here thinking I'm enlightened, I realize it's just early senility. So, I mean, there is delusional states, and people fall into these states. And that's why humility is so important in our Islamic tradition. The Prophet said, I was commanded to be humble, despite being a prophet, so that no one would see themselves better than another. And that's why a true sage in the Islamic tradition sees everybody as better than them, even the ignorant ones, because they might have an excuse with God because of their ignorance, whereas somebody who knows has no excuse.
And is there something like a cosmic consciousness that pervades reality, that's independent of God? Or
you
not?
know, I'm a little hesitant to use words that are outside of our tradition. There's an understanding that God has absolute knowledge, and his knowledge is everywhere, that God's knowledge, he is with us wherever we are. His knowledge is with us. God knows everything. God knows what's happening. And so in that way, God is mindful of his creation. And in fact, the Quran says, there's an amazing verse that says that we will show you our signs on the self and in the horizon until it becomes clear to you that this is truth. And then it says, does it not suffice you that God is witnessing all things? So this idea that things could not exist without the witnessing of God, kind of the idea that, you know, and this is, as you know, in physics, this idea of if the observer is not there, does it exist? Well, for us, if God is not observing us, we don't exist.
What about the creation of consciousness itself, our awareness? That requires some sort of an implantation of a soul from God?
Absolutely. It's a light. We believe that consciousness is a light that God has placed into the human being. And that
This is not metaphor.
This is not metaphor. It's a light.
It's something that's,
Yeah,
that has that's a non-physical something. I'd say non-physical.
It's a spiritual light.
Substance,
Yeah.
a spirit.
It's a spiritual light.
And it's resonant in each person as their own
thing. And the mirror of the soul has to be polished, because the light cannot shine through unless there's a polishing. And the polishing of that is mindfulness, is remembrance of God. That's how one polishes the soul. And if that polishing occurs, then reality begins to present itself as it is, reality.